He thought wiring money home was enough until a Navy SEAL returned and found his father on the street. Daniel came back to Seabrook believing he had fixed everything from afar, but before he even reached the house, his K9 shadow suddenly stopped. A low growl. A sharp pull toward the rain-soaked sidewalk, and under a flickering streetlight an old man sat there, broken, forgotten, and waiting. The rain came down in long, patient threads over Seabrook, a quiet coastal town where the ocean never truly slept. And neither did the wind that carried its salt into every crack of wood and memory. It was the kind of rain that didn't rush, didn't storm, but lingered, soaking through layers, as if it had all the time in the world to remind people of things they had tried to forget. Daniel Carter stepped out of the cab with the controlled stillness of a man who had spent most of his life learning how not to react too quickly. His tall frame straight, his shoulders broad and steady beneath a dark jacket that had seen better days but still carried the discipline of how it was worn. At 41, Daniel was a former Navy SEAL, the kind of man whose presence didn't need to announce itself loudly, because it settled into a space with quiet authority, built from years of decisions made under pressure where hesitation could cost lives. His face was sharply defined, a strong jawline edged with short stubble, a thin scar cutting across his left cheekbone from an operation he never spoke about, and eyes the color of cold steel, observant, calculating, always searching. But the one thing that softened him, just slightly, stood beside him on a leash. Shadow was a 6-year-old German Shepherd K9, lean but powerful, with a thick coat of dark sable fur that glistened under the rain, his ears alert, his amber eyes sharp with intelligence that went beyond simple training. He had been with Daniel through missions that had broken other men, had once refused evacuation after an explosion overseas, staying beside Daniel until backup arrived, and since then the bond between them had become something deeper than command. It was trust carved into instinct. The driver muttered a quick goodbye, already eager to leave the rain, and Daniel barely acknowledged it, his attention already shifting to the street ahead, to the familiar outline of a place he hadn't seen in years. He had told himself, during long nights in foreign lands, that sending money home was enough, that building a better life from a distance was still a form of care, that absence could be justified if the outcome looked stable. It had been easier to believe that than to face the quiet guilt that sometimes slipped through the cracks of his discipline. Shadow walked beside him at first, calm, controlled, his movement steady. But then something changed. It was subtle at first, a slight tightening in the leash, a shift in posture, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice, but Daniel did, because noticing small changes was what had kept him alive. Shadow stopped, completely. His body stiffened, ears forward, a low growl forming deep in his chest, not aggressive, but warning. Daniel's grip on the leash tightened instinctively. "Easy," he said quietly. His voice low, steady, the same tone he had used in combat zones, but Shadow didn't move. That was wrong. Shadow always responded. The dog pulled forward, not wildly, but with intent, guiding rather than reacting, drawing Daniel toward the edge of the road where an old wooden awning stretched out from a closed storefront, its paint peeling, its structure tired, like something that had been left behind by time. The rain hit harder there, bouncing off the ground, pooling into shallow puddles that reflected the flickering streetlight above, and beneath that light something moved. At first, it looked like a pile of discarded fabric, a shape too still to be human, but then it shifted, slow, uneven, like something struggling to hold itself together. Daniel followed, his boots splashing softly against the wet pavement, his mind already narrowing, focusing, assessing. Shadow reached the figure first, his growl fading into something quieter, something almost uncertain, and he lowered his head slowly, cautiously. That was when Daniel saw him. The man sitting beneath the awning was old, but not in a peaceful way, not in the way of someone who had aged with comfort. He was thin, painfully so, his frame reduced to sharp lines beneath layers of worn clothing that hung loosely, soaked through, clinging to him like they no longer belonged. His hair was gray and unkempt, strands falling over a face that had once been strong, but now carried deep lines carved by time and hardship. His skin pale, almost fragile, his hands trembling slightly where they rested in his lap. Beside him were two old bags, filled with what little remained of a life, the fabric darkened by rain, sagging under the weight of everything that hadn't been worth stealing. The man flinched when Daniel stepped closer, not violently, but reflexively, like someone who had learned that attention often came with consequence. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thin, automatic, as if the words had been repeated too many times. "I won't stay long." The apology hit Daniel in a way he hadn't expected. Not loud, not immediate, but heavy, settling somewhere deep where he kept things he didn't want to examine too closely. Shadow moved closer, slower now, lowering himself carefully and gently pressed his nose against the man's hand. The man froze, his fingers twitching, as if unsure what to do with something that wasn't rejection. Daniel crouched down, his movements controlled, his eyes studying the man's face, not as a stranger, but as something his mind was trying to place, piece by piece. There was something familiar there. Not obvious, not immediate, but buried beneath the weight of time and neglect. A line near the jaw, the shape of the brow, a memory that resisted being recognized. Behind them, across the street, a small figure stood partially hidden near a fence. Lily Harper, 10 years old, thin, with light brown hair tied into a loose ponytail, her oversized hoodie hanging off her small frame, watched from a distance. She was the kind of child who noticed things adults ignored. Quiet, observant, her wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and stubborn kindness. She had been leaving pieces of bread under the awning for weeks, always at a distance, always running away before the old man could see her. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know how to be brave enough to stay. Tonight, she didn't run. She watched as the tall man and the dog knelt in front of the old veteran, her small hands gripping the fence, her heart beating faster without fully understanding why. Back under the awning, Daniel leaned closer, his breath steady, but something inside him tightening. Recognition didn't come like a flash. It came slowly, painfully, like something rising from deep water. And when it finally reached the surface, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like something breaking. "Dad." The word left his mouth before he could stop it. Low, strained, almost disbelieving. The old man blinked, his eyes shifting toward him, searching. But there was no clarity there, no recognition, only confusion and a faint flicker of something that didn't quite form. "I'm sorry," the man whispered again, pulling his hand slightly back, as if even this moment might be something he wasn't allowed to keep. Daniel didn't move. He couldn't. Because everything he had believed, everything he had justified, stood there in front of him, soaked in rain, reduced to something fragile and alone. Shadow pressed closer to the old man, resting his head gently against his hand, not as a command, but as a choice, as if trying to bridge a distance that words couldn't reach. And under the dim, flickering light, Daniel Carter knelt in the rain, facing the man who had once raised him, and understood, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that he had not fixed anything at all. The rain had softened into a fine mist by the time the hospital doors closed behind Daniel Carter, sealing him inside a world that smelled of antiseptic and quiet urgency, a place where pain was not loud but constant, lingering in the air like something that never truly left. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow across the hallway, flattening shadows and stripping everything down to its bare truth. And Daniel stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his tall frame rigid, his hands still damp from the rain, his mind slower than it had ever been in combat, because this was not something he had trained for, not something that could be solved with precision or force. Beside him, Shadow remained close, his paws silent against the polished floor, his ears slightly lowered now. His alertness softened into something more uncertain, as if even he could feel that this place required a different kind of strength. A nurse approached them with careful steps, her posture professional but her eyes cautious as they flicked briefly toward the German shepherd, then back to Daniel. Her name badge read Emily Ross, a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair tied into a loose bun, strands escaping around her face, her features gentle but marked by the quiet fatigue of long shifts, the kind of person who had learned to carry other people's pain without letting it show too much. She spoke softly, as if the hallway itself demanded it, explaining where they had taken Henry, her tone calm, practiced, but with a hint of something warmer beneath the surface, something that suggested she had seen too many cases like this and had not yet learned how to become completely indifferent. Daniel nodded once, his expression controlled, but his eyes sharper now, as if anchoring himself to information instead of emotion, and he followed her down the corridor where every step echoed slightly louder than it should have, until they reached a narrow room at the end. Inside, the sound of a heart monitor filled the silence with a steady rhythm that felt almost too fragile to trust. And Henry Carter lay on the bed, smaller than he had appeared under the awning, as if the light here revealed not just his condition, but the full extent of what had been lost. His face was pale, the lines deeper, his gray hair flattened against his scalp, and his hands rested at his sides with a stillness that did not belong to rest, but to exhaustion. A doctor stood near the foot of the bed, reviewing a chart with quiet focus. Doctor. Samuel Carter, no relation, though the name felt like a quiet coincidence, was a man in his mid-40s, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and a neatly trimmed beard that framed a face more accustomed to concentration than comfort. His dark hair was beginning to gray at the temples, and his eyes held a steady, analytical calm, the kind that came from years of delivering difficult truths without hesitation. When he looked up, his gaze met Daniel's directly, not avoiding, not softening, but also not unkind. "He's stable for now," he said, his voice measured, clear, every word chosen carefully. "But severely malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of cognitive decline, likely due to prolonged neglect." The word settled into the room heavier than anything else. Neglect. It did not sound like an accident, not like something that happened quickly, but something that built over time, quietly, without interruption. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign that the word had reached him. But inside something shifted in a way he could not control, something colder, heavier, settling into place. "How long?" he asked, his voice low, steady, but sharper than before. "Doctor." Carter did not hesitate. "Weeks at least, possibly months," he replied, his tone unchanged. "This doesn't happen overnight." Months. The word echoed in Daniel's mind with a clarity that left no room for denial. Months of sending money, of believing everything was handled, of trusting that distance could be bridged by transactions. He stepped closer to the bed, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if approaching something fragile that could break under the wrong pressure. Shadow followed, positioning himself near the foot of the bed, his body low but present, his gaze fixed on Henry with a quiet intensity that no one questioned. Outside the room, footsteps passed, voices murmured, life continued, but inside, everything narrowed to the space between Daniel and the man lying there. Henry stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering before opening, his gaze unfocused at first, drifting across the room until it landed on Daniel. There was a pause, a moment where something almost connected, but it slipped away before it could take shape. "Who are you?" Henry asked, his voice faint, uncertain, carrying none of the strength Daniel remembered. The question landed harder than anything the doctor had said. Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he did not know what to say, but because the truth of the moment required more than words. He leaned forward slightly, his hand hovering before gently taking Henry's, the contact careful, almost hesitant, as if he were afraid of causing harm. "It's me," he said quietly, his voice softer than it had been in years. "Daniel." Henry's brow furrowed faintly, his gaze searching, trying to find something familiar in a face that had changed with time and distance. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his lips moved again, the same words as before, but softer, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be a burden." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, but it was enough for something inside him to crack. Not visibly, not in a way anyone else could see, but deep enough that it would not mend easily. He opened them again, his expression settling back into control, but the weight remained. Across the hallway, a small figure stood near the corner, partially hidden behind a vending machine. Lily Harper had followed at a distance, her small shoes damp, her hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands as she pressed herself against the wall, peeking toward the room. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, filled with a mix of worry and determination. She had not meant to come this far, had not planned it, but something about seeing the old man taken away had pulled her here, against the warnings she had heard so many times from her mother. Speaking of which, Sarah Harper stood at the far end of the hallway, her arms crossed tightly, her posture tense. She was a woman in her late 30s, tall and slender, her blonde hair cut just below her shoulders, her face sharp with concern, more than anger, though it often came out the same way. Life had not been easy for her, raising a child alone after her husband had left years ago, and that had carved a certain hardness into her, a need to protect what little stability she had, even if it meant pushing her daughter away from things that felt uncertain. "Lily," she called softly, but firmly, her voice carrying just enough to reach without drawing attention. Lily hesitated, glancing back once more toward the room, then slowly stepping away, though her eyes lingered, as if trying to hold on to the image of the man and the dog and the silent connection between them. Back inside, Daniel remained seated, his hand still holding Henry's, his thoughts no longer moving in clear lines but circling, returning again and again to the same realization. This had not been sudden, not unavoidable. This had been allowed, and he had been part of that, whether he had meant to or not. The doctor spoke again, outlining next steps, treatments, plans, but the words blurred together, not because they lacked importance, but because Daniel's mind had already moved beyond them, locking onto something deeper, something that could not be fixed with medicine alone. Henry's eyes began to close again, his body too tired to stay awake, his breathing evening out as sleep took him, but just before he drifted fully, he whispered once more, barely audible, "I didn't want to bother anyone." Daniel sat there, unmoving, the words settling into him like something final, something that could not be undone. For the first time in years, the man who had faced gunfire without hesitation felt something he could not control. Not fear, not anger, but something quieter, heavier, guilt. And it did not pass, did not fade, but remained, steady and unrelenting, as he looked at his father and understood, with a clarity sharper than anything he had known before, that he had not just been absent. He had been gone when it mattered most. The morning came without warmth, a pale gray light stretching across Seabrook as if the town itself was still holding its breath after the night before, and the air carried that damp, lingering chill that followed rain along the coast, seeping into wood, into skin, into memory. Daniel Carter stood outside the house he had not seen in years, his posture still, his broad shoulders squared beneath his jacket, his eyes fixed on the structure that should have felt familiar but instead stood there like something abandoned by time. The paint faded, the porch sagging slightly, the windows dull with neglect. Beside him, Shadow remained close, his body quiet but alert, his amber eyes scanning, his instincts picking up something wrong before it was visible, his tail low, not in fear but in unease. Daniel had imagined this moment differently during long deployments, had pictured returning to something intact, something waiting, something that would confirm his belief that distance had not broken anything essential. But now, standing there, he felt none of that certainty, only a slow tightening in his chest as he stepped forward and pushed the door open. It creaked under his hand, the sound louder than it should have been, echoing into the hollow space beyond. The first thing that struck him was not what he saw, but what he didn't. There was no furniture, no scent of life, no trace of the home he had carried in his memory. The living room was empty, stripped down to bare walls and worn floorboards, the faint outlines of where objects had once stood still visible like ghosts pressed into the space. Daniel stepped inside, his boots making a dull sound against the wood. Each step measured, controlled, but slower than usual, as if he were walking through something fragile. Shadow followed, his nose lowering to the floor, moving methodically, tracing the absence of scent, the lack of continuity, and then he let out a low, uncertain whine. Something Daniel had rarely heard from him, not even in the chaos of combat zones. It was not fear, but confusion. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as he moved further in, his eyes scanning, cataloging, confirming. The kitchen told the same story, only harsher. The refrigerator was gone, leaving behind a clean rectangle against the wall where it had once stood, the stove missing. The cabinets open and empty, their doors hanging slightly crooked as if they had been searched and then abandoned. On the floor, near the sink, a single metal bowl remained, its surface stained, a thin layer of dried residue clinging to its edges, the kind that came from food left too long without care. Daniel paused there, his gaze lowering, his mind filling in the gaps he didn't want to see, the image forming without permission. His father sitting alone, eating from that bowl, or not eating at all. He exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, but heavier than it should have been. In the hallway, the air felt colder, narrower, as if the house itself was closing in. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and when Daniel pushed it open, he stopped completely. There was nothing inside. No bed, no dresser, no personal items, only a thin, worn blanket folded unevenly in the corner of the floor. The kind of blanket that did not belong to comfort, but to survival. For a moment, Daniel did not move, his mind no longer analyzing, no longer processing in clean lines, but holding on to that single detail. His father had not just been neglected, he had been living like this, on the floor, in this empty space, without anything that resembled care. Shadow stepped into the room behind him, his head lowering further, his body slowing, and then he let out another soft sound, a quiet whine that seemed to carry more weight than any bark could. Daniel turned slightly, his hand resting briefly on the dog's neck, grounding himself in something real, something that had not changed. Behind him, a voice broke the silence. "I was wondering when you'd come back." Daniel turned slowly, his eyes settling on the doorway where a woman stood. She was older, in her early 70s, tall but slightly stooped with age, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun, her face lined deeply but not weak, her eyes sharp and observant, the kind that had spent years watching quietly, noticing what others ignored. Her name was Margaret Wells, a retired schoolteacher who had lived next door for over 40 years, known in the neighborhood as someone who spoke little but saw everything. She held her hands together in front of her, not nervous, but steady, her posture firm despite her age. Daniel did not speak immediately, his gaze steady, waiting. Margaret stepped forward slightly, her eyes moving across the empty room before returning to him. "He started selling things months ago," she said, her voice calm but edged with something heavier, something that had been building for a long time. At first, it was small items, things people wouldn't notice. Then it got bigger, furniture, appliances, anything he could move without drawing too much attention. She paused briefly, her lips pressing together, as if deciding how much to say. "Your brother, Ryan." The name landed exactly where Daniel had expected it, but hearing it spoken aloud made it final. "I tried to talk to him," Margaret continued, her voice tightening slightly. "Told him this house wasn't his to strip, that your father was still living here, but he wouldn't listen." Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened, the shift subtle but unmistakable. Across the yard, near the fence line, Lily Harper stood again, her small figure partially hidden, her hands clutching the edge of her hoodie as she watched. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, her feet moving quietly across the damp grass. "He slept on the floor," she said suddenly, her voice small but clear enough to carry. Both Daniel and Margaret turned toward her. Lily swallowed, her eyes flicking briefly to Daniel before settling somewhere lower, not quite able to hold his gaze. "I saw him," she continued, her words coming faster now, as if once she started, she couldn't stop. "Some nights, when the lights were off, he would sit there, just holding a cup of water, like he was waiting for something." She shifted her weight slightly, her shoulders hunching, and then one day, he wasn't inside anymore. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, a faint sigh escaping her, not of surprise, but of confirmation. Daniel stood there, silent, the pieces aligning in a way that left no room for doubt, no space for denial. This had not been sudden, not accidental, not unavoidable. It had been deliberate. Every item removed, every choice made, every moment his father had been left alone in this empty space. Daniel walked back into the center of the room, his movements controlled, deliberate, his face unreadable. But everything inside him shifting into something colder, something more focused. He looked around once more, not searching, not questioning, but confirming what was already clear. There was nothing left here. Nothing but absence. Shadow moved closer to him, his body pressing lightly against Daniel's leg, his presence steady, grounding. And then the dog let out a low, soft whine, his head tilting slightly as if trying to understand something that did not make sense even to him. Daniel lowered his hand once more, resting it briefly against Shadow's neck, his grip firm, not for the dog, but for himself. And in that empty house, with the echoes of what had once been still lingering in the silence, Daniel Carter stood still, his gaze fixed ahead, and for the first time, the full weight of what had happened settled into something undeniable. This was not just loss. It was something taken, something allowed, something that had been stripped away piece by piece while he had been somewhere else, believing everything was fine. And beside him, Shadow, a dog who had faced chaos without hesitation, let out another quiet sound, as if even he could not make sense of the kind of cruelty that left a man with nothing but a blanket on the floor. Seattle rose out of the mist like a city that had learned to hide its truths behind glass and steel, its skyline sharp and distant, its streets alive with movement that never truly paused. And yet beneath that motion there was a quiet detachment, a sense that people here passed one another without ever truly seeing. Daniel Carter stepped out of the cab with the same controlled precision that had followed him from battlefields to empty homes. His tall frame steady, his expression unreadable, his mind already fixed on a single destination. Shadow moved beside him, his gait smooth, his eyes alert but quieter than before, as if even he could feel the shift in purpose, the narrowing of focus that came when Daniel stopped searching and started moving toward something inevitable. The building stood in stark contrast to everything Daniel had left behind in Seabrook, a high-end apartment complex with polished glass doors, a marble lobby, and a kind of curated silence that spoke of money and control. Inside, a concierge glanced up briefly, a man in his late 50s with neatly combed gray hair and a posture that suggested years of practiced politeness. His name tag reading Leonard, but there was a flicker of hesitation when his eyes landed on Shadow. Not fear exactly, but uncertainty, the kind that came from recognizing something disciplined and powerful that did not quite belong in this environment. Daniel didn't slow, didn't explain, his presence alone enough to make the man step aside without protest. The elevator ride was quiet, the soft hum of machinery filling the space between breaths, and Daniel's reflection in the mirrored wall looked back at him unchanged, but he could feel the difference beneath the surface, the tightening, the clarity. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched out clean and controlled, soft carpet absorbing sound, warm lighting casting an almost artificial comfort, and at the end of it stood the door he had been looking for. He didn't knock. He pushed it open. Inside, the air was different, warmer, carrying the faint scent of expensive cologne and polished wood, a contrast so sharp it almost felt deliberate. Ryan Carter stood in the center of the living room, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to collapse into something unspoken. Ryan was 38, younger than Daniel, but carrying himself with a confidence that had always come too easily. His features smooth, his jaw less defined, but still clean, his dark hair styled neatly, his shirt crisp, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest effortlessness, and yet there was something in his eyes that had shifted, something restless beneath the surface. He had always been the kind of man who avoided conflict, who preferred charm over confrontation, the younger brother who had grown up in the shadow of discipline and had chosen comfort whenever he could find it, shaped not by hardship, but by the quiet habit of stepping away from it. When he saw Daniel, that ease cracked, not completely, but enough. "You shouldn't just walk in like that," Ryan said, his voice attempting steadiness but lacking the authority to carry it. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward once, Shadow moving in sync beside him, the dog's posture firm, his eyes locked on Ryan with a calm that felt heavier than aggression. "I found him," Daniel said finally, his voice low, controlled, each word placed carefully. The room seemed to shrink around the sentence. Ryan's expression shifted, the practiced calm slipping just slightly. "I can explain," he replied quickly, too quickly, the words coming before he had fully decided what they meant. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice, he simply waited, and that silence pressed harder than anything else could have. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, the movement breaking the clean lines of his appearance, his posture losing its balance as he paced once, then stopped. "It wasn't like that at the beginning," he said, his tone quieter now, less certain, as if speaking the truth required him to slow down. "I just needed a little, just to get through things, and I told myself I'd put it back." His gaze dropped briefly to the floor before lifting again, searching Daniel's face for something that wasn't there. "You were gone, Dan. You built your life somewhere else, and I was the one still there dealing with everything, the bills, the repairs, him." He hesitated, the word catching slightly, and it never stopped. It just kept piling up. Shadow shifted slightly, his ears flicking forward, sensing the uneven rhythm in Ryan's voice, the instability beneath the surface. Daniel remained still, his expression unchanged, but inside, the words were not landing the way Ryan expected. "So I took a little more," Ryan continued, his voice dropping further. "And then a little more after that, and it got easier. Every time it got easier to tell myself it didn't matter, that I deserved something too." He let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "And then I couldn't stop." The admission hung in the air, fragile and exposed. Outside, far from the controlled quiet of the apartment in Seabrook, Lily Harper sat at the small desk in her room, the afternoon light filtering softly through the window, casting long shadows across the paper in front of her. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her small hands moving carefully as she sketched, the lines uncertain at first, then stronger, more deliberate. The drawing showed a tall figure standing beside a dog, both facing an old man beneath a small awning, the rain falling around them. Lily's tongue pressed lightly against her lip as she worked, her expression serious, as if she understood that what she was capturing mattered. Her mother, Sarah Harper, passed by the doorway, pausing briefly, her arms crossed as she watched, her face softer than it had been the night before. She didn't interrupt this time. She didn't tell Lily to stop. Something about the quiet determination in the child's posture held her there, uncertain but no longer resistant. Lily finished the drawing, her fingers tracing the edges before she picked up her phone, hesitating for just a moment before taking a picture and posting it to a local community page. Her caption, simple, almost hesitant. Someone should help him. Back in Seattle, the silence between Daniel and Ryan stretched, filled with everything that had already been said and everything that didn't need to be. Daniel took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, but enough to close the distance in a way that made the space between them feel defined. "There's a line," he said quietly, his voice steady, unchanged. "You don't cross it." Ryan didn't respond. He couldn't. His hands curled slightly at his sides, his jaw tightening as if he wanted to argue, to defend, but the words no longer held. Daniel's gaze remained fixed, not searching, not questioning, because there was nothing left to understand. "You crossed it," he finished, the sentence landing with a finality that did not require volume. Shadow stepped forward just enough to stand beside Daniel, his presence grounding, his body still, his eyes unwavering. Ryan looked at them both, and for the first time there was no defense left in him, only the quiet realization of what could not be undone. Daniel held that moment for a second longer, then turned, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if the outcome had already been decided long before he arrived. He did not look back. He did not need to. And as the door closed behind him, the city continued on as it always did, indifferent, distant, carrying forward without pause, leaving Ryan alone in the silence of everything he had tried to ignore. The rain had long passed, but Seabrook still carried its memory in the damp air that clung to every surface, and in the quiet spaces between people where something unspoken had begun to shift. The town did not change all at once, not in loud declarations or sudden acts of kindness, but in small glances that lingered a second longer, in footsteps that slowed near the old Carter house, in conversations that carried a name that had once been ignored. Daniel Carter stood outside a modest office building on the edge of town, its brick exterior worn but maintained, a place that did not promise comfort, but offered something steadier, something grounded in reality. Beside him, Shadow waited with calm patience, his posture relaxed but alert, his amber eyes tracking movement without urgency, as if he understood that this was not a place for action, but for decisions. Inside, the office smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, and behind a wide desk sat Robert Hargrove, a man in his early 50s with a lean, angular build and a presence that did not demand attention but held it nonetheless. His gray-streaked hair was combed neatly back, his jaw sharp beneath a closely trimmed beard, and his eyes carried a kind of quiet precision that came from years of dealing with situations where emotion often clouded judgment. He was known in Seabrook and beyond as someone who did not raise his voice, did not dramatize, but who saw clearly and acted accordingly, a lawyer who had once built his reputation in larger cities before returning to a slower place, not because he had failed, but because he had chosen to. Daniel sat across from him, his posture straight, his expression controlled, but the tension in his hands, resting loosely on his knees, betrayed the weight he carried. "You're not here for revenge," Hargrove said, after listening, his voice calm, almost observational, as if stating a fact rather than asking a question. Daniel's gaze did not waver. "No," he replied simply. The word held more meaning than it seemed. Hargrove nodded once, his fingers steepling briefly as he considered, then lowering to the documents spread before him. "Then what you're asking for is accountability," he said, his tone unchanged. "And that requires structure, not emotion." He began outlining the steps with methodical clarity, each detail placed with care. The financial records that would need to be traced, the assets that could be recovered, the legal obligations that Ryan Carter would face, not in the form of punishment designed to satisfy anger, but in consequences that could not be ignored or avoided. Daniel listened without interruption, his mind aligning with each point, not because he needed guidance and discipline, but because this was a different kind of battlefield, one where the outcome depended on patience rather than force. Outside, life in Seabrook continued to move, but something had begun to ripple beneath the surface. Lily Harper sat cross-legged on the floor of her living room, her small hands wrapped around her phone as she stared at the screen with a mixture of disbelief and quiet pride. The drawing she had posted had spread further than she had imagined, shared across local groups, commented on by people she did not know. The simple image of a man, a dog, and an old veteran under the rain resonating in a way she could not fully understand but could feel. Her name was not attached in a way that made her visible, but the message was, and it carried something stronger than recognition. Sarah Harper stood nearby, leaning against the doorway, her arms no longer crossed in resistance but resting loosely at her sides, her expression thoughtful, her earlier tension replaced by something more complicated. She had spent years protecting her daughter from uncertainty, from risk, from anything that might disrupt the fragile balance she had built, but now she watched as Lily became part of something larger, something that did not fit neatly into her rules. "You started something," Sarah said quietly, her voice softer than usual. Lily looked up, unsure if she was in trouble, but Sarah's gaze held no anger, only a cautious acceptance. Back in the office, Hargrove leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes settling on Daniel with a steadiness that suggested the conversation had reached its core. "There's one more thing," he said, his tone shifting just enough to carry weight. "This only works if he participates. If he refuses, it becomes something else entirely." Daniel's expression did not change, but his answer came without hesitation. He won't refuse. The certainty in his voice did not come from hope, but from understanding. Hargrove studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if accepting that statement not as confidence, but as fact. The following days unfolded without spectacle, without the kind of visible confrontation that people expected when harm had been done. Ryan Carter returned to Seabrook not in triumph, not even in resistance, but in a quiet, diminished way that stripped away the image he had built for himself. His posture was tighter, his movements less certain, his appearance still clean but lacking the ease that had once defined him. He sat across from Hargrove in the same office, his hands clasped together, his gaze lowered more often than not, listening as the terms were laid out with the same clarity Daniel had heard before. repayment of every dollar taken, documented and tracked, financial oversight that removed his ability to access or misuse funds freely, and enrollment in a structured rehabilitation program designed not to punish, but to force engagement with responsibility he had avoided. The man overseeing that program, Thomas Green, was introduced briefly, a broad-shouldered figure in his late 40s with a weathered face and a calm demeanor. A former counselor who had worked with veterans and individuals struggling with accountability, his approach firm but not unkind, shaped by years of witnessing both failure and change. Ryan did not argue. He did not attempt to negotiate. He nodded slowly, as if each condition settled into him with a weight he could not ignore. Outside, the town continued to respond in its own quiet way. Small groups gathered near the Carter house, not out of curiosity, but out of a growing awareness that something had been missed, that someone had been overlooked. Food appeared on the porch, not in abundance, but enough. Blankets were left folded neatly, tools offered, repairs suggested. It was not charity in the way people often understood it, but something closer to acknowledgement. Lily watched it all with wide eyes, her small figure moving carefully among adults who now spoke more softly, who glanced at her with a kind of recognition they had not given before. And in the center of it, Daniel remained steady, not drawing attention to himself, not seeking validation, but continuing with the same quiet determination that had carried him through everything before. When he returned to the hospital that evening, the light had shifted into something warmer, softer, and Henry Carter lay resting, his breathing even, his face no longer as drawn as it had been. Daniel sat beside him, his presence quiet, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the bed, not touching, but close. For the first time he felt something change, not in the past, not in what had already been done, but in what came next. Outside, beyond the walls of the hospital, Seabrook had begun to see what it had once overlooked, and though nothing was fully repaired, something had been acknowledged, something had been brought back into view. And that, more than anything, marked the beginning of something different. The morning light over Seabrook came in quietly, slipping through the thin coastal mist as if the town itself was waking more gently than before. And for the first time in a long while, the Carter house no longer stood entirely alone against it. Daniel Carter was already at work before the sun fully claimed the sky. His sleeves rolled up, his hands roughened by effort rather than neglect, moving with a deliberate rhythm that came from years of discipline. Though this time there was no command structure, no mission briefing, only the steady act of rebuilding something that had nearly been erased. The house still carried the scars of absence, bare spaces where life had been stripped away. But now those spaces were being filled again, not quickly, not perfectly, but honestly. Shadow moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, his nails clicking softly against the wooden floor as he checked each corner, his instincts still alert but no longer searching for danger, instead settling into something more grounded, more protective. His thick sable coat had begun to regain its full sheen. His posture relaxed in ways it had not been since they first arrived, yet his eyes never strayed far from Daniel or the door, as if guarding not just the house but the fragile sense of stability returning within it. The first knock came just after Daniel had set a new frame into the doorway, the sound firm but not intrusive. When he opened it, a man stood there holding a worn but sturdy wooden chair. His name was Carl Benson, a retired fisherman in his late 60s, broad-shouldered despite his age, his skin weathered by decades of salt air and sun, his gray beard thick and uneven, his eyes steady and direct. Carl was known in Seabrook as someone who spoke little but acted when it mattered, a man shaped by years of hard work and quiet losses at sea, the kind of person who understood what it meant to rebuild without needing recognition. "Figured you might need this," he said simply, stepping forward without waiting for permission, placing the chair carefully inside. Daniel gave a small nod, the gesture carrying more gratitude than words would have. Not long after, others followed. Not in a rush, not in a crowd, but in a steady stream that spoke of intention rather than obligation. A middle-aged couple brought a small table, their movements coordinated, their expressions warm but reserved. A young man delivered a box of kitchen utensils, setting it down with a quick smile before leaving. Each person contributed something small, something practical, something that did not demand acknowledgement but offered presence. Across the street, Lily Harper stood watching, her hands clasped tightly together as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her usual hesitation holding her back at the edge of the yard. Sarah Harper stood behind her, her posture no longer rigid but thoughtful, her gaze moving between her daughter and the house. She had spent years teaching Lily to be careful, to avoid situations that might bring trouble, but now she saw something different unfolding, something that could not be dismissed as risk alone. "You can go," Sarah said quietly, her voice softer than it had ever been when it came to this subject. Lily turned, surprised, her wide eyes searching her mother's face for hesitation, but found none. For a moment she didn't move. Then slowly, carefully, she stepped forward, crossing the yard with small deliberate steps. Inside, Daniel was adjusting a cabinet when he heard the light creak of the floor near the entrance. He turned to see Lily standing there, her figure small against the space, her hands clutching the edge of her hoodie, her eyes flicking briefly to shadow before settling somewhere lower. "I brought bread," she said softly, holding out a small paper bag as if it were something fragile. Daniel stepped closer, his movements slower now, less guarded, and took the bag with a slight nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter than before. Not distant, not formal, but genuine. Shadow approached carefully, lowering his head slightly, his posture calm, inviting rather than imposing. Lily hesitated for a moment, then reached out, her fingers brushing against the dog's fur, her expression shifting from fear to something closer to wonder. Upstairs, in the room that had once been empty, Henry Carter sat propped against pillows, his frame still thin but no longer as fragile as it had been, his eyes clearer, though still shadowed by confusion that came and went like distant waves. A nurse had discharged him earlier that morning under Daniel's supervision, trusting that the care he would receive here would be steadier than anything the hospital could provide in the long term. Henry's gaze moved slowly across the room, taking in the small changes, the objects that had returned, the presence that had replaced absence. His fingers twitched slightly against the blanket, as if reaching for something just beyond memory. Daniel entered quietly, pausing for a moment at the doorway, watching, not wanting to disrupt whatever fragile process was unfolding. "Someone brought bread," he said gently, placing the bag on a nearby table. Henry looked toward him, his brow furrowing slightly, his gaze lingering longer than before. "You've been busy," he murmured, his voice still soft but carrying a faint trace of something that had once been stronger. Daniel allowed himself a small breath, not quite relief, but something close. "We're getting there," he replied. Downstairs, the sounds of quiet activity continued. Footsteps, low voices, the movement of things being placed back into the house. Carl's deep voice drifted upward briefly, giving simple instructions to another man, their conversation steady, practical. Lily moved slowly through the living room, her eyes taking in every detail, as if committing it to memory. Shadow followed her at a distance, his presence constant but gentle, a silent reassurance. As the day stretched on, the house began to feel different, not complete, not restored, but alive in a way it had not been before. And in the late afternoon, as the light shifted into something warmer, softer, Daniel sat beside Henry once more, the two of them in quiet stillness. Shadow lay at the foot of the bed, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but still aware. Henry's gaze drifted again, settling on Daniel, and this time it held. Longer than before, steadier. His lips parted slightly, as if forming something that had been out of reach for too long. "Daniel," he said. The name fragile but clear, not questioned, not uncertain, but recognized. The word settled into the room with a weight that did not need to be explained. Daniel did not move immediately, his breath catching just slightly before he leaned forward, his hand resting gently over Henry's. "I'm here," he said quietly, the words simple but grounded in something that would not shift again. Shadow lifted his head, his ears twitching slightly as if acknowledging the moment, then settled back down, his body relaxed, his presence steady. And in that quiet room, with the fading light casting long shadows across the floor, something that had been broken began, slowly, to take shape again. Not through force, not through words, but through the simple act of being there. The days in Seabrook began to settle into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first, not because it was difficult, but because it required something Daniel Carter had not practiced in years: staying. The mornings arrived quietly, carried in by the soft light over the ocean and the distant sound of waves folding into themselves, and for once Daniel did not wake with the instinct to move on, to prepare for departure, to measure time in missions and distances. Instead, he woke to the slow, steady breathing of a house that was no longer empty, to the faint creak of floorboards that now held weight again, to the presence of something he had once believed he could replace with effort from afar. Shadow adjusted first, his routine shifting from alert vigilance to something more grounded, though never entirely relaxed, his body still carrying the quiet readiness of a dog trained for conflict, but now tempered by the absence of it. He spent his mornings near the porch, watching the street with calm attention, his ears lifting occasionally at passing sounds, his tail moving slowly when familiar faces appeared. Henry Carter grew stronger by degrees, not in sudden leaps but in small, consistent steps that mattered more. He walked a little farther each day, his posture still slightly stooped but steadier, his voice gaining strength, though his memories returned unevenly, fragments surfacing without warning, sometimes clear, sometimes distant. Daniel learned not to push, not to force clarity where it would not come, instead sitting with him in the quiet moments, allowing the past to find its way back on its own terms. One afternoon, as the sun lingered longer over the yard, Henry stood beside him near the fence, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond it. "I remember teaching you to fix that gate," he said slowly, his words measured, as if testing their own truth. Daniel nodded once, the memory settling into place between them, simple but real. It was enough. The decision came not in a single moment, but in a series of small realizations that aligned into something undeniable. Daniel found himself less drawn to the calls that still came from his former life, less willing to step back into a pace that now felt distant, disconnected from what stood in front of him. The idea of leaving again, of returning to a cycle of absence, no longer held the same weight. It felt incomplete. One morning, he stood at the edge of the small property behind the house, the ground uneven but open, and saw not what it was, but what it could become. The thought did not arrive as a plan, but as something quieter, something that felt like recognition. Shadow stood beside him, his gaze following Daniel's line of sight, as if sensing the shift before it was spoken. Later that day, Daniel visited an old training facility on the outskirts of town, a place that had once been used for basic obedience training before falling into disuse. The man who managed it now was Victor Hale, a former police K-9 handler in his late 50s, broad-shouldered with a heavy build that age had not diminished, his face marked by a thick mustache and deep-set lines that spoke of years spent outdoors, his movements slower but deliberate. Victor had retired after an injury ended his field work, a torn ligament that never fully healed, but he had remained connected to the work in quieter ways, maintaining the facility, offering occasional guidance. His personality was direct, sometimes blunt, but not unkind, shaped by years of relying on instinct and discipline rather than words. When Daniel approached him with the idea, Victor listened without interruption, his arms crossed, his gaze steady. "You're not just talking about training dogs," he said after a pause, his voice low but certain. Daniel shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "I'm talking about helping the men who come back and don't know where to go next." Victor's eyes held his for a moment longer. Then he gave a small nod, the kind that carried agreement without unnecessary words. "Then you'll need more than space," he said. "You'll need patience." Daniel allowed a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close. "I've got time," he answered. Back in Seabrook, the idea began to take shape, not through announcements or plans laid out in detail, but through action. The old facility was cleared, repaired, brought back to life piece by piece, much like the house had been. Word spread quietly, carried through conversations, through the same channels that had once overlooked Henry. A few veterans from nearby towns came first, hesitant, uncertain, men who carried their experiences in ways that were not always visible, but always present. One of them was Marcus Doyle, a man in his early 40s with a lean build and a face that seemed older than it should have been, his dark hair cut short, his eyes sharp but distant, as if always measuring the space around him. Marcus had served multiple tours and returned with a kind of restlessness that made stillness difficult, his hands often moving, his posture rarely fully relaxed. He did not speak much at first, observing more than engaging, but he stayed, and that alone meant something. Shadow responded to him carefully, not forcing interaction, but remaining nearby, offering presence without demand. Lily Harper became a constant presence as well, her small figure moving through the space with a growing confidence, her initial hesitation replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. She helped with simple tasks, carrying water bowls, organizing supplies, sitting near the dogs as they adjusted to new handlers. Her laughter, when it came, was soft but real, a sound that did not disrupt the environment but added to it. Sarah watched from a distance at first, her protective instincts still present. But she began to step closer, her trust building slowly as she saw the effect this place had, not just on her daughter, but on the men who came through it. She spoke with Daniel one afternoon, her posture more relaxed than before, her tone measured but sincere. "You've changed things here," she said, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. Daniel shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "I just stayed long enough to see what was already there." The days continued, steady, grounded, and in the quiet moments between activity, Daniel found something he had not expected. Not peace exactly, but direction. One evening, as the sun lowered and the air cooled, he sat beside Henry on the porch, the two of them watching the light fade across the yard. Shadow lay at their feet, his body stretched out, his breathing slow and even. Henry turned his head slightly, his gaze settling on Daniel with a clarity that had become more consistent. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice steady, not fragile, not uncertain. The question did not come with pressure, only with space. Daniel did not answer immediately. He let the silence settle, not avoiding the question, but allowing it to hold its full weight. He thought of the years behind him, the choices made, the distance justified, the moment that had brought him back. Then he looked at what was in front of him now, not perfect, not complete, but real. "I think I'm learning how to be." he said finally, his voice low, honest, not trying to simplify what could not be simplified. Henry nodded slowly, as if that answer was enough. And in that quiet exchange something settled into place. Not as a resolution, but as a beginning that would not be abandoned again. The afternoon settled over Seabrook with a softness that felt earned rather than given. The sunlight stretching gently across the quiet street and resting against the Carter house as if it had finally found a place it was meant to stay. The structure itself still bore the marks of what it had endured. Small imperfections in the wood, patches where repairs had been made without concern for appearance, edges that did not align perfectly, but none of it felt broken anymore. Instead, it felt lived in, held together not by design, but by presence. Daniel Carter stood just inside the doorway for a moment, his tall frame still, his hand resting lightly against the wood as his eyes moved across the space, taking in the details that had become familiar in ways he had not expected. The table near the window, slightly uneven but sturdy. The chairs that did not match but carried weight again. The faint sound of movement from the kitchen where something simmered quietly. It was not what he had imagined years ago when he thought of providing a home, but it was something real, something grounded in the kind of effort that did not disappear when he left the room. Shadow lay stretched near the entrance, his body relaxed in a way that would have seemed impossible not long ago, his thick sable coat clean and full, his breathing slow and steady, though his ears still lifted at certain sounds, a reminder that even in peace, some instincts never fully faded. Henry Carter sat at the small table, his posture straighter now, his frame still thin but no longer fragile, his hands steady as he turned a cup slowly between his fingers, his eyes clearer, more present. Time had not erased what had happened, but it had given him space to return, piece by piece, to something resembling himself. "You've made it yours again," Henry said quietly, his voice carrying a calm strength that had once defined him. Daniel stepped further inside, a faint shift in his expression suggesting something deeper than acknowledgement. "We made it," he replied, the word deliberate, inclusive, no longer separating himself from what stood around him. Outside, the yard had changed as well, not in structure, but in spirit. Lily Harper ran across the grass with a kind of energy that had grown alongside her confidence, her laughter light but steady, her small figure no longer lingering at the edges but moving freely through the space. She had become part of the rhythm of the house, her presence as natural as the breeze that moved through the open windows. Sarah Harper watched from near the fence, her posture relaxed, her arms no longer crossed in quiet defense but resting at her sides, her expression softer than it had been in the early days. She had learned, slowly, that not everything unfamiliar carried danger, that some changes brought stability rather than risk. She stepped closer now without hesitation, her voice carrying a warmth that did not need to be emphasized. "He's been asking about you," she said to Daniel, nodding toward Henry with a small smile. Daniel gave a slight nod in return, the exchange simple, grounded. From the far end of the yard, Marcus Doyle stood near the fence, his posture still somewhat guarded, but no longer distant in the same way, his shoulders less tense, his gaze more anchored. The work at the training space had continued steadily, not growing quickly, but growing honestly, shaped by the people who chose to stay rather than pass through. Shadow moved occasionally toward Marcus, not in command, but in quiet companionship. A presence that did not demand, but offered. The day carried on with a calm that did not feel temporary, and as the sun shifted lower, casting longer shadows across the ground, Daniel stepped outside, his gaze settling on the porch where Henry now sat, the older man leaning back slightly, his eyes following the movement in the yard. Beside him, Shadow had repositioned, lying close enough that his presence could be felt without being intrusive, his head resting near Henry's feet. It was a placement that spoke of trust, of familiarity, of something that had been rebuilt without words. Henry's gaze lifted toward Daniel as he approached, holding there with a clarity that no longer wavered. "You stayed," Henry said, not as a question, but as a recognition. Daniel nodded once, the motion steady. "I'm not leaving," he answered, the words carrying a finality that did not require emphasis. From inside the house, the sound of the mailbox closing broke the quiet moment, a small, ordinary interruption that carried more weight than it should have. Daniel turned, stepping back inside, retrieving the envelope left within. It was addressed in a familiar hand, though the lines were less confident, the strokes uneven. Ryan Carter had always written with ease, his handwriting smooth, controlled, but now it carried hesitation, as if each letter required more effort than before. Daniel stood there for a moment, the envelope in his hand, his expression unchanged, but his thoughts moving through something that did not settle immediately. He opened it slowly, the paper inside folded carefully, the words written with a kind of restraint that did not attempt to justify, did not attempt to soften. Ryan's apology was not elaborate, not persuasive, but direct. He acknowledged what he had done, not as a mistake, but as a series of choices he could no longer deny, and he did not ask for forgiveness, only the chance to continue making things right, one step at a time. Daniel read it once, then again, his gaze steady, his mind not searching for hidden meaning but accepting what was present. Behind him, Henry stepped into the doorway, his movement slower but deliberate, his presence no longer uncertain. "From him?" Henry asked, his voice calm. Daniel nodded slightly, folding the letter once more. There was no immediate answer, no decision spoken aloud, only a quiet understanding that some things required time, not distance, but time. "He's trying," Daniel said finally, his tone measured, not defensive, not dismissive. Henry considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod, his gaze shifting toward the yard where Lily's laughter carried lightly through the air. "That's where it starts," he replied. The conversation did not go further, not because it lacked meaning, but because it had reached a place where words were no longer necessary. As the evening settled in, the light softened into something warm. Wrapping around the house and the people within it, Daniel stepped back onto the porch, his posture relaxed in a way that would have been unfamiliar before. He watched as Lily slowed her running, her energy settling into a quiet contentment, as Sarah spoke with Henry in low tones, their voices steady, as Shadow remained at his place, a silent presence that had witnessed every step of the journey. Daniel's gaze moved across it all, not as an observer passing through, but as someone anchored within it. He was no longer measuring time by departure, no longer defining himself by distance. He stood there, not as a soldier preparing to leave, but as a man who had chosen to remain. And in that moment, with the fading light casting long shadows across the yard and the quiet sounds of life continuing around him, Daniel Carter understood something with a clarity that did not shift. He had not returned to fix something broken. He had returned to be part of what came after. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Sometimes the miracle is not loud, not sudden, not something that arrives with light and wonder the way we imagine, but something quieter, something that waits patiently until we are ready to see it. It is the moment God opens our eyes to what truly matters before it is too late, the moment we realize that love is not measured by what we send from a distance, but by the time we choose to stay. In our daily lives, we become busy, we chase success, we convince ourselves that providing is enough. Yet the people who once stood beside us, who prayed for us in silence, are the ones we slowly drift away from without even noticing. God does not always speak through miracles that change the world. Sometimes he speaks through a breaking point, through a moment of truth that brings us back to where we were always meant to be. This story is a reminder that it is never too late to return, never too late to sit beside someone, to listen, to be present, to choose love again. If this message touched your heart, take a moment today to reach out to someone you care about. Do not wait for regret to teach you what presence could have given freely. Share this story with someone who might need it. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what part stayed with you the most. And if you believe in second chances, in healing, and in the quiet miracles God places in our lives, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey together. May God watch over you, protect your family, and guide your steps with peace, wherever you are and wherever you go.